Hi, welcome to Rules Challenge. My name's Carter Maxwell, and in this episode we're going to be taking a look at the game Nevsky from GMT Games. For those of you who are new to the show, it's basically just a test of your understanding of the rules of the game. But instead of just asking you questions about the rule book, it'll be more like you're watching a real game being played. I break it up into numbered sections, and your job is to figure out if the moves you watched during that section were legal or illegal. I deliberately emphasize rules that people tend to misunderstand or forget. So in addition to working as a test, it functions somewhat like a video FAQ. Before we get started on the challenge itself, there are a few things I should explain about the video. I'm recording this video in December 2022, and eventually a second edition of the game will come along, probably in 23 or 24. And there will be some official rules changes there. Now, I've seen a list of the proposed changes, and I'm not seeing anything yet that would make this, the moves in this video obsolete, but it's something you should be aware of, and you'll want to check those changes if you're watching this, long after I've released the video. And by the way, if you're watching this after the second edition has come out and you're not sure what edition you have, the way you can tell is just look at the edge of the box. Below the GMT Games logo, they always have a number down here, like mine says 1908. I don't remember what the 08 stands for, but the 19 is the year this was published. And then you look at a game that has subsequent editions, like Twilight Struggle. That came out in 2005, so my number starts with 05, and then it's -11 because I have the 2011 deluxe edition. Also, I should mention that I'm not using the advanced vassal rule in this video. Not that I'm against it or anything. I just am focusing in this video on things that I think would help new players, and I think new players should avoid using that rule until they've got a few games under their belt. And the last thing I wanted to mention is just to tell you what scenario you're going to be seeing here. This is the Return of the Prince scenario. You'll see most of the first 40-day period. I do skip over some parts of the levy phase, but I'll catch you up on what's happened so far as we get into the challenge. Recall that at the very start of the scenario in the first 40-day segment, when we do the Arts of War phase, we resolve the cards for their capabilities, not for the events. So Andreas drew Raiders and Ordensborgen, and we tucked the Raiders card under his mat because that's this Lord card. And then because Ordensborgen affects everybody, we tuck that under the board on the Teutonic side. Those will have some effect on the game, so I'll make note of it when those are coming into play. Alexander drew a no capabilities card, so we just discarded that. And the other draw was the Archbishopric, so we tucked that under the board. By the way, I had mentioned in the intro that some of the rules might be changing. And one of the things likely to change is the way that the no event, no capability cards are handled. Here I had mentioned that the Russian side had drawn that card and then discarded it to their Arts of War deck. But in the future, they may change that so when you draw one of these cards, you remove it from the game entirely. And I think that's probably just to make sure that no one can get stuck drawing a lot of these over the course of a game. So that's a change you'll want to look for. Andreas had 3 lordship points to spend, and he spent 2 of them and managed to muster both Yaroslav and Rudolf. And then with the 3rd point, he mustered this vassal here that gave him a light horse and a militia. With that, I think we're ready to get started. Now we're going to pick up the action with the Russians taking their muster turn. I like to mark lordship points with a die just so I don't lose how many have been spent. Alexander is going to spend his first lordship point to try to muster the Karelians. At the moment, both Andre and the Karelians are available to muster. He's looking for a 4 or less. Rolls a 3, so that'll bring in the Karelians. He has his choice to give them any transport. He'll go with a cart. He's going to take advantage of this Archbishopric card that says Russian lords have an extra seat at Novgorod. And that will allow him to place the Karelian cylinder there. Now we need to place the Karelian service marker on the calendar, and their service rating is 2, so we'll place it 2 from the current period So we'll move it 1, 2. With his next lordship point, he's going to add a boat to his mat. He'll spend his next point to bring in an Arts of War card for the Luchniki capability, or however you say that, the massed archers, and he'll assign that to the Karelians. And then with his final lordship point, he'll muster this vassal, which will add a men-at-arms to his board. Moving on to the call to arms phase, the Teutons will skip that because the William of Modena card is not in play. For their call to arms, the Russians are going to use this opportunity to gain a victory point, so they'll slide Andrei 1 space right on the calendar. And for doing that, they get to add a victory point marker to the Vesh box. And we'll mark that victory point for the Russians on the scoring track. That wraps up the levy phase, so we'll go ahead and flip the marker on the calendar to the campaign side. There are a few things I want to talk about from this levy phase, but first let's talk about what the Russian side did wrong. The problem was with the assignment of this Luchniki capability to the Karelians. Now keep in mind there are two main types of cards. There are the This Lord cards that are assigned to a particular lord, and then there's the cards that affect everybody that get placed under the main game board. This is a This Lord card. Lords can only levy This Lord capabilities for themselves. They can't assign them to other lords. With this particular card, the problem is compounded by the fact that Alexander's coat of arms isn't even shown on it. That means it's not even a card that he can levy, and then if it had been a card he could levy, he would have to assign it to himself, not to the Karelians. By the way, technically these vassal markers shouldn't even be on Alexander's mat yet, the ones for the Steppe Warriors. You really shouldn't put those on the mat until the Steppe Warriors card is in play. I didn't even notice that until I'd finished recording almost the whole video. It doesn't affect gameplay though, so I didn't bother going back and re-recording all the footage where that appears. Another thing I wanted to touch on here was the idea of a discard. I had mentioned that the Russians had drawn a no capability card and discarded it. And that seems to create a lot of confusion. People hear the word discard and they tend to assume that discards are going into a discard pile. There's no such thing in this game though. If you discard a card, it goes right back into your Arts of War deck and it's immediately available again. The last thing I wanted to say about the levy phase is just a quick reminder to be careful about which lords you're allowing to take muster actions during the levy phase. It's not necessarily an issue at the start of a scenario because I think the lords on the map generally start in positions where they're able to muster. But later in the game, it's easy for your lords to start the levy phase in unfriendly locales. And trade routes are I think the locales that trip people up the most. Just as an example, let's say that this has been conquered by the Teutons and Herman's sitting in there. Starting the levy phase, it's easy to assume that he is able to take muster actions, but that's not a friendly space right now. And I'll talk more about trade routes later. I just wanted to issue that reminder that you do need to exercise some caution during the levy phase and carefully check each lord whether they're in a friendly or unfriendly locale. Okay, now we're into the campaign phase, and both sides have finished their planning, so it's time for us to reveal the first Teuton's command card. We'll turn it over and see that it's Andreas. Now, just like with the lordship points, I like to mark the command points with a die so I can keep track of them better. And Andreas won't be starting in a commandery, so the Ordensborgen card won't apply this turn. For starters, Andreas wants to move from Kupure to Vod, and we see that's a trackway between those two locales. We'll check his mat, and we'll see he does have one cart, but he has two provender, and he doesn't want to be laden for this move, so he's going to abandon one of those provender. We'll mark that he's spending one command point for that march, and we'll move his cylinder. Now we have to mark him with a moved marker. With his next command point, he wants to march to Neva, and we already know he has one provender and one cart, so that won't be a laden move. So now he'll march from Vod to Neva. We'll move that marker with him. And immediately we'll place a conquered marker there. We'll move the Teuton's victory point marker to reflect that extra victory point. And note the expenditure of the command point. Now we'll spend Andreas's final command point. He wants to use that last command point to ravage with the Raiders card. That card says, this Lord with horse, he has plenty of those, once per command card may ravage locale adjacent by trackway, where no enemy lord. So he looks at Ijora, it's adjacent by trackway, and there's no enemy lord, so he'll go ahead and place a ravage marker there. And we'll add a half point to the Teuton's victory point marker. And then for having ravaged there, Andreas will take 1 provender and 1 loot. And he'll add those to his mat. That concludes Andreas's command card, and since he has a moved marker, he needs to feed. Andreas has 6 units, so he'll just pay 1 provender. For the pay phase, Andreas wants to take advantage of this loot he just gained, so he's going to spend that so he can move on the calendar. And that allows Andreas to shift his service marker 1 space right. No one else is going to make any payments now, so we just need to check all lords for disband, and we've got 5 on the board and all 5 service markers are in good shape. To wrap up this command card, we'll remove Andreas's moved fought marker. There were 2 things that made this turn illegal. When Andreas ravaged Ijora, he should not have gained a loot. That locale is a region, and regions only provide 1 provender. They don't also provide a loot like other types of locales do. We should talk a bit about trade routes. Now I'm just going to move these aside so we can see the locale better. I've seen people describe strongholds as spaces with a red box around the name, but that's overgeneralizing because trade routes have that red box, but they are not strongholds. I've already mentioned that that can be significant for the muster phase, but it's also important for how it affects Teuton's marches, or doesn't affect them. The way Andreas handled this was correct. When he marched into Neva, he immediately placed a conquered marker, and it did not end his command card. And that brings us to the second thing the Teutons did wrong on this turn. In addition to the fact that Andreas shouldn't have gotten loot when he ravaged Ijora, he shouldn't have spent loot during the pay phase while he was sitting in Neva. For a lord to spend loot, he has to be in a friendly locale. And what exactly is a friendly locale? Well, the first criteria is that it either has to be in the lord's own territory, which he obviously isn't. He's deep into Russian territory. Or he has to be in a conquered stronghold. This locale was conquered, but it's not a stronghold. Now, there are additional criteria for determining that a site is friendly, but Andreas has failed the most basic test. He's not in his own territory, and he's not in a conquered enemy stronghold. So that's not a friendly space. He cannot spend loot during the pay phase. All right, now let's move on to the Russians' first command card of the campaign. We'll flip over the top card, and that's Alexander. Since he's starting his turn in Novgorod, the Archbishopric card will come into play, and that says Russian lords have an extra seat in Novgorod, which is fine, and start their command +1. So that latter part comes into play here. So instead of just having 3 command points to spend this turn, he'll spend 4. For starters, Alexander wants to march with the Karelians up to Tsaovo, and neither of them even has any provender at this point, so being laden isn't an issue. So he'll just spend 1 command point and move both cylinders to Tsaovo. Then we'll mark both of them with a moved fought marker. Now Alexander wants to march with the Karelians again, this time over a waterway to Zaltsi. So he'll spend 1 command point and move both cylinders along with their move fought tokens. Now Alexander is going to spend a command point to take a supply action. And now, just for the sake of clarity on the video, I'm going to place a supply source marker there on Novgorod. I could also place one on Rusa, but it's not necessary because of the Archbishopric card. Remember that Russian lords have an extra seat at Novgorod. So by placing a supply source there, we have access to 2 seats for Alexander. Now we need to make sure that Alexander can actually trace back there, and both of the feasible routes are the same, 1 waterway and 1 trackway to reach there. We'll double check the Russian lords' mats to make sure we have the necessary transport, and sure enough we do have at least 1 boat and 1 cart. So Alexander will gain 2 provender. Then for Alexander's final command point, he'll take a supply action again, do the exact same thing, trace back to Novgorod, gain 2 provender. We'll remove that supply source marker. Now that Alexander's used up his command points, that wraps up the command card, so we'll do a feed, paid, disband phase. And both Alexander and Karelians need to feed because of their move fought markers. Alexander will spend 1 provender for himself, and then since the Karelians don't have any provender, he'll share 1 with them, so we'll spend another provender. No one's going to pay a lord, and nothing's changed as to the service markers, so we'll just go ahead and remove these move fought markers and wrap up the turn. Everything this turn was done correctly. I do want to talk a little bit though about the sharing of provender, just to emphasize that that sharing is very limited. Let's take a look at a couple examples where sharing isn't legal. Let's say when Alexander took his supply action and gained the 2 provender, that he wanted to share some of that with the Karelians. So he took 1 for himself and 1 for the Karelians. That's not legal. When you take a supply action, all that provender has to go on the mat of the active lord who's taking that action. Let's take a look at another one. Let's say Alexander's sitting on a bunch of provender. Next command card comes up and it's for the Karelians. And they want to be able to move without Alexander but have some provender. They couldn't just, while they're in the same location as Alexander, take some of the provender that he's sitting on. They can use it for feeding when they're together, but Alexander can't just move stuff to the Karelians' mat so they can take it with them. I also want to point out something about that supply action. Now, because of the Archbishopric card, Alexander right now has 2 seats in Novgorod, and then he also has a seat down in Rusa. So I theoretically could have placed supply source markers on each of those, traced to both locations, and gained 3 supply, except when you take a supply action, you can never use more than 2 of the Lord's seats for supply. So there was no point in using Rusa as a supply source because gaining access to a 3rd seat does him no good. Moving back to the Teutonic side, we'll flip over their next command card and see that Rudolf is up now. Just like with the Archbishopric card on the Russian side, the Ordensborgen card is going to come into play here because Rudolf's starting in a commandery, so that means he will start there with command +1. So I'm going to place a 4 die on the command card just to keep track of that. With his first command point, Rudolf wants to march from Felin to Dorpat, and that's over a waterway. Taking a look at Rudolf's mat, we see he has a cart but no boat, so no way to transport that provender, so he's just going to abandon that provender. And now we'll move his cylinder. Because of that, we need to put a moved marker on him. Now, with his next command point, he's going to march over a waterway again, this time all the way up to Narva. So we'll move the cylinder, move his marker with him. He'll spend his 3rd command point to continue on marching across this trackway to Kybalovo. And he'll spend his 4th and final command point to forage here in Kybalovo. And that will gain him 1 provender. Moving on to the feed, paid, disband phase, he does have to feed, so he'll spend that provender he just gained. Nobody's going to pay any lords, and nothing's changed as to service marker, so no one has to disband. To wrap up the command card, we'll remove that move fought marker. We've come to the thing I feel I most need to talk about in this video, marching without suitable transport, like how Rudolf moved to Dorpat across a waterway without boats, or up to Narva without boats. That seems to be the concept in this game that people struggle with the most. They look at that and think that's illegal. Say, well, you can't move across a waterway if you don't have a boat. But the rulebook explicitly addresses this. It says, important, transport is never needed to march. Transport only affects your ability to carry provender with you as you're making that march. Rudolph didn't carry any provender with him during those 3 marches, so we don't care what sort of transport he had. For the sake of making it intuitive, don't picture in your mind's eye a bunch of troops sitting in a boat moving along a waterway. Picture them marching along a path alongside a waterway. In other words, don't picture something like this, but instead picture something like this. I don't want to undersell the value of transport in this game. It is extremely hard when you're running your lords around the map without a way to transport provender with them. But it's not illegal to march without transport, and sometimes you're in a hurry and it just needs to be done. Let's take a look at the next command card, and it's Karelians. And the Archbishopric card isn't relevant anymore, so Karelians will get 2 command points. They want to march to Kybalovo across this waterway. They don't have any provender, so there's no issue there, so we'll spend 1 command point and march them up to Kybalovo. And we'll mark them with the move fought marker. Now Rudolph has to decide if he's going to avoid battle, withdraw, or fight. And he's not liking the look of that Luchniki card that gives all the Karelian units archery, so he's just going to avoid battle up to Kapure. And we'll mark him with a move fought marker. And then we'll mark Kybalovo with a siege marker. The Karelians know they're going to have to feed at the end of this command card, so they'll spend their last command point to forage here and gain 1 provender. Now that the command card's done, we're into the feed, paid, disband phase, and both Rudolph and Karelians need to feed. Starting with the Teutons, Rudolph doesn't have any provender, so he's going to have to move his service marker. So we'll move that 1 space left on the calendar. Then the Karelians will spend 1 provender. No one's going to pay this turn, so we'll move on to the disband phase. Since we did have a service marker shift, we'll double check the calendar, but it looks like Rudolph's still in good shape here. To wrap things up, we'll get rid of those moved fought markers. The mistake here was that the Karelians spent another command point after they had entered Kybalovo and put it under siege. When you enter a space with an enemy stronghold that's not already under siege, you have to put the siege marker, and that ends your command card. It's probably worth noting here that the presence of Rudolph had nothing to do with ending the command card. It was just the fact that there was an unbesieged enemy stronghold there when Karelians entered. Let's say they had met over here, Karelians move in, Rudolph avoids battle. Well, that wouldn't end the Karelians' command card because they didn't fight and he hasn't entered an enemy stronghold. So in this case, he could have continued spending command points. All right, moving back to the Teutons, the next command card is for Rudolph. And he's not going to be starting his turn in a commandery, so he'll just get his regular 3 command points. For starters, he just wants to forage a couple times, so I'll just mark off those first 2 command points. His first forage action there will give him 1 provender, and then the second one will give him a 2nd provender, and we'll go ahead and put that on his mat. Now he wants to take a ravage action, so we'll spend that last command point. We'll place a ravaged marker there and give the Teutons a half point. It's hard to see under all that, but Kapure is a fort, so we'll give Rudolph a provender and a loot. The command card is done, so moving on to the feed, paid, disband phase. Rudolph doesn't have a move fought marker, but he does want to pay, so he'll spend this 1 loot, and he'll move his service marker 1 space right on the calendar. No one else wants to pay, no one needs to disband, so that'll end the command card. This turn saw another Ravaging heir. Running through the checklist of requirements for ravaging, the locale must be in enemy territory, so we were good there, and it must be unconquered and unfriendly. But this base had already been conquered by the Teutons. So at the time Rudolf took his ravage action, that was illegal. Now that doesn't mean that it's impossible for Teutons to ravage Kapure or other Russian strongholds. It just means they have to do it before they've conquered it. You could do that possibly by raiding or by ravaging it while it's still under siege before you have successfully conquered it. We see an example of that down here in Skoff right at the setup of the scenario. We start out with the ravage marker there, and that only would have been possible by the Teutons ravaging that locale before they had conquered it. Alright, the Russians are up again. Let's see who's on their next command card. It's Alexander, and he will get 3 command points this turn. Alexander wants to march along this waterway to Kybalovo. Checking his map, he has 2 provender and 2 boats, so he's not laden and he's able to carry all that provender. So we'll spend the first command point and move his cylinder. And then we have to mark him with a moved fought marker. Now he wants to continue on to Kapure, and that's along a trackway. Checking his map, he only has 1 cart. So with 2 provender, he would be laden for that. So that march would cost him 2 more command points. So we'll spend both of those and move his cylinder. And we'll move this marker up with him. Now Rudolf has to decide if he's going to avoid battle, fight, or withdraw. And he'll withdraw into the castle. And then we'll place a siege marker there. Alexander's the only one with a moved fought marker, so he needs to feed. He has just 6 units, so he'll pay 1 provender. No one's going to pay. No service markers have moved, so no one needs to disband. So we'll remove that move fought marker. Now everything that turn was legal, but a couple of things might have raised eyebrows. One was that Rudolf, when he withdrew into the castle, did not receive a moved fought marker. But that was correct. If he had avoided battle, say gone to Vod, then he would have gotten a marker. But just withdrawing into the stronghold does not get you saddled with a moved fought marker, and can be one of the advantages of withdrawing rather than avoiding. The other thing is the way Alexander had just waltzed right through Kybalovo on his way to Kapure. Now, I had just earlier been emphasizing that the Karelians, when they entered that space, had to end their command card. So what changed? The fact that this time Kybalovo was already under siege when Alexander got there. So he did not have to end his command card and place a new siege marker. He was able to just wave and keep on going. Okay, back to the Teutons and their next command card, and it is Rudolf again. Rudolf's in a kind of terrible situation right now, holed up in this castle with a much more powerful force outside, so he's just going to pass. That moves the action back over to the Russians, so they'll draw their next command card, and that's the Karelians. With their first command point, they want to forage. And it's summer, it hasn't been ravaged there yet, so they'll gain 1 provender. We'll add that to their mat. And with their last command point, they're going to storm. For starters, let's mark that with a storm marker. We'll move the Karelians mat to the battle area. And just so it's not so hard to see, I'll put the battle board out and put the garrison on it. Now we'll move the siege marker from the board between them to indicate that the Karelians will get wall roll. The Karelians don't have any held events to play, so we'll go ahead and start with the defender's archery, which would be the garrison's crossbows. The garrison gets a half hit, which rounds up to 1, and then the Karelians will get to roll for walls, so they'll roll 1 die looking for a 1. And that fails. Now the Karelians have to assign a unit to absorb the hit, and they'll choose this militia here. They're looking for a roll of 1, and that's a success. Now as the attacker, the Karelians get to go, and they do have archery because of that Luchniki capability. Each of these does a half hit, so that's 2.5, rounded up to 3. First, the garrison gets to roll for walls, looking for a 1, 2, or 3. That's 2 fails and 1 success. So the garrison now has to try to absorb 2 hits. They'll roll for protection, looking for a 1, 2, or 3. And those both fail. So that routes the garrison. We'll remove them to supply. And we'll return the Karelians' mat. Now we have to resolve the spoils for that fort. We'll remove this black conquered marker. And that reduces the Teuton's victory points by 1. And then per the player aid, the Karelians will gain 1 provender, 1 loot, and 1 coin. We'll get rid of the siege marker and the storm marker, and we'll mark the Karelians as move fought, and then we'll go ahead and resolve the feed pay disband phase. The Karelians just have 5 units, so they only need to use 1 provender for the feed. Now for the pay phase, the Karelians are the only ones that are going to do anything. They're going to hang on to this coin for now, but they would like to use up this loot to keep them mobile, so they'll pay that. For that, they get to move their service marker 1 space right. And it looks like no one will need to disband. And then we'll get rid of the move fought marker to wrap up the command card. Everything on that turn was done correctly. There are a couple things worth highlighting. First, recall that storming does not require your entire command card, unlike a siege action. So it was fine that the Karelians did a forage action with their first command point, and then with their second command point started that storm. Also, I should note that it was fine for the Karelians to avoid that hit from the garrison on a protection roll of 1. The immediate reaction to that is sometimes, well, wait a second, these units only have a protection roll of 1, and the garrison is -2 to protection. But that's not precisely true. The garrison crossbows are -2 to armored protection rolls. So, say if the Karelians had a knight, and he was making a protection roll, well, his armor is 4, so that would be reduced from a 4 to a 2. But none of these units are armored, so that -2 to their crossbows does not affect those Karelian units. You know, and while we're talking about garrison crossbows, if you do have armored units present, they have to take those hits from the crossbows before your other units. You know, the temptation is to say, well, I'm not going to have my armored units face those -2 modifiers, so I'll just throw up my weak units against those hits. But no, these unarmored units can't take those hits before the armored units. All right, moving over to the Teutons. Their next command card is for Andreas, and he'll get 3 command points. With Andreas's first command point, he wants to use this Raider's ability, and again, that allows him to ravage a locale adjacent by trackway where no enemy lord. So he takes a look at Karelia. It's adjacent by trackway, no enemy lord. So he'll put a ravage marker there and mark that half victory point. Since Karelia is just a region, he'll gain 1 provender but no loot. Now he wants to march to Vaud, and that's a trackway. Checking his map, he has 2 provender and just 1 cart, so that march would be laden, and he does not want to make a laden march, so he's going to abandon a provender. So we'll move his cylinder and add a moved fought marker. Then he'll spend his last command point and march to Kapure. Alexander now has to decide if he's going to avoid battle or stay and fight, and he will choose to stay and fight. That means there's going to be a battle, so first we'll put a battle marker there. I've set up their mats across from each other. Andreas is the attacker, Alexander's the defender. Neither of them has any held event cards they can play at this time. So Rudolph needs to decide if he's going to sally, and Rudolph decides that he will. So we'll set him behind Alexander. Remember that Alexander had that castle under siege, so he'll get to use those siege works against Rudolf. And we'll place that as a reminder between their mats. Both sides first have a chance to concede the field, but nobody's going to do that. First up would be archery, but nobody has any archery. Next up is defending horse, which would be Alexander's knights. This is a battle, not a storm, so they each do 2 hits for a total of 6. So the Teutons need to roll for protection against those 6 hits. They'll start out by trying to have the militia absorb that, and that needs a roll of 1. And that fails, so we'll rout that. Then the light horse, which also needs a roll of 1. And that fails. And we'll move that vassal marker down with them. Then the next hit will be allocated to Rudolph's men-at-arms. They need a 1, 2, or 3. And that succeeds. So they'll go right back to them. That fails. Now the Teutons will switch it over to Andreas's men-at-arms. That fails. And that final hit they'll allocate to Rudolph's sergeant. He needs a 1, 2, or 3. And that succeeds. Now it's attacking horse's turn, but we do need to do it separately because Rudolph's attacks are going past these siege works. So we've got 1, 2, 3 hits from Rudolph's horse and 4 from Andreas's horse. First, Alexander will roll for walls against those 3 hits, and since there's 1 siege marker, he's looking for 1s. And he got 1. We've got those 2 hits that got through from Rudolph and 4 from Andreas, so now Alexander has to absorb a total of 6. He'll allocate the first 3 against these 3 men-at-arms, and they need 1, 2s, or 3s. 2 successes, 1 fail, so we'll move a men-at-arms down. We'll roll 2 more dice for these 2 men-at-arms. 1 more success, 1 more fail. Slide another 1 down. 1 more protection roll to make against this men-at-arms. And success. Now the defending foot get to go. They'll deal 1 hit. And the Teutons will allocate that to Rudolph's sergeant. He needs a 1, 2, or 3. And he got a 3, so that's a success. Now it's time for the attacking foot to go, but the Teutons don't have any foot left that's unrouted. So that finishes this first round of battle. Now we need to go back to the concede the field phase. So far, everything has been done correctly in this turn. One thing that may seem a little off is that the Teutons keep assigning hits to Rudolph, even though Andreas is the one that's face-to-face with Alexander. But that's fine. This sallying force, except for the fact that they have to go past these siege works, they operate like a flanking lord. So you can kind of picture them as if they're right here next to Andreas, and Andreas can assign these hits from Alexander however he wants. Now we need to do the concede the field phase again, and this time the Teutons are going to concede. So we need to put the pursuit marker out, facing or pointing toward Andreas. That does apply to Rudolph as well, even though he's out here behind Alexander. Now we have the reposition phase, but there's nothing to be done now. Now the archery phase, and again, nobody has any archery. Now it's defending horse, and again, Alexander's knights will do 6 hits. Teutons will assign the first one to Rudolph's sergeant. He needs a 1, 2, or 3. That's a success. Rolls again for the second hit. That's a fail. So we'll slide him to the routed box. Now they'll assign 2 more hits to Andreas's 2 sergeants. And we have 1 success, 1 fail. The sergeant will try to absorb the 5th hit. And that's a fail. They still have 1 more hit to absorb, so they'll try to have Rudolph's knight take it. He needs a 1, 2, 3, or 4. And that's a fail. Now that Rudolph's forces have all routed, Rudolph himself routes, and he would normally be removed from the array. But this battle's about to wrap up, and we'll need to resolve his losses anyway, so I'm just going to leave his mat here. Now attacking horse goes. Normally that would be 2 hits, but due to the pursuit, we have that, so it's just 1 hit. Alexander's going to assign that to his men-at-arms, looking for a 1, 2, or 3. And that's a fail. All these men-at-arms are gone, so we'll move this vassal marker below the routed line too. Nobody has any foot units left, so that wraps up that round of the battle. And then since the Teutons had conceded at the start of the round, that finishes the battle. The winner is the Russians, since the Teutons had conceded. As the losers, the Teuton lords need to withdraw or retreat, so they're going to withdraw into the castle. Now all the routed units need to roll against their protection, and I'm just going to assign the dice as they line up relative to the units. So we've got Rudolph's 3 here. That'll be a 6, a 1, and a 4. So that piece is gone. This one survives, and this one survives. Oops. Andreas has 5 units that have to roll. So we've got a 4, 6, 3, 5, 4. Not a great roll. The 4 to this guy, he's gone. 6 to this guy, he's gone. 3, he survives. 5 to this one, he's gone. 4 to this one, he's gone. Now Alexander, his 3 routed men-at-arms. We've got a 4, a 1, and a 4. So 2 are gone, and 1 stays. Now we're to the spoils phase, but no spoils are awarded because both of the losing lords withdrew. Also, neither of them has to roll to move their service marker, again because they both withdrew instead of retreated. We need to make sure all 3 of them are marked as moved, fought. We'll replace the siege marker and remove the battle marker. We have to return the lord's mats. Now we're into the feed, pay, disband phase, and both Rudolph and Andreas have moved fought markers. So Rudolph will spend a provender, and Andreas will. For the Russians, Alexander also has to feed, so he'll spend a provender. Then no one's going to pay. For disbands, we know no service markers were moved, so nobody will have to disband. So we'll just remove these move fought markers. In the second part of resolving this battle, just one mistake was made, but it could have huge ramifications for how the rest of the game plays out. After a battle, a lord who is attacking a besieger, and remember, Andreas was our attacker, attacking Alexander, who had the castle under siege. That attacker, if he loses, can't withdraw into the stronghold. The rules do imply otherwise, but the designer of the game, Volko Runke, has confirmed that this attacker cannot withdraw into the stronghold. And I imagine this will be clarified in the next edition of the game. In case you want to note this in your rule book, it's under Rule 4.4.3. The 5th bullet point should say, marching attackers who lose may not withdraw, but must retreat to the locale from which they approached. It was okay that Rudolph withdrew into the stronghold. In fact, by rule, he had to withdraw into the stronghold. But Andreas was supposed to retreat to Vod. Not only would he have finished the turn in a different locale, but he also would have suffered the result of a retreat, which is significantly worse than withdrawing. On a separate note, I should probably point out that it is correct that the siege marker stayed in place. Just because there was a battle and a sally doesn't make the siege markers totally go away. Now, if there were multiple siege markers here, the sally would have eliminated those, but the sally only reduces siege markers down to 1. It doesn't completely wipe them out. All right, on to the next Russian command card. So we'll turn over this card, and it's Alexander. I'll mark his command points with my little counter, but actually we don't even need it because Alexander's going to spend his whole command card to do a siege action. All right, to advance a siege, first he might have been able to roll for surrender, but since there are Teutonic lords there, that's not an option. Then he looks at whether or not he can add a siege marker, and castles have a rating of 2, so he would have needed a second Russian lord there to be able to add a siege marker. So really nothing will happen except for adding moved fought markers to everybody. Now all those lords that have moved fought markers need to feed. We'll start with the Teutons. Rudolf will spend 1 provender. Andreas doesn't have any provender, so Rudolf will share his remaining 1 with him. Now Alexander needs to feed, but he does not have any provender, so he'll have to shift his service marker. And that'll go 1 space to the left. Nobody's going to pay. All the service markers are in good shape, so no disbands are necessary. All that's left then is to remove these move fought markers. Alexander's action this turn raises the question, can a lord even besiege a stronghold if he can't add a siege marker? The answer is an emphatic yes, and it's crucial to be aware of this when dealing with a powerful lord holed up in a stronghold. Even though Alexander couldn't add a siege marker because he needed another Russian lord there, he could take a siege action. This marks all lords present at that locale with move fought markers, even though these guys are just holed up inside their stronghold. This looked like a bad deal for Alexander now because he's the only one who had his service marker shifted. But those Teutonic lords are out of provender now, and every subsequent siege action is going to be big trouble for them. One other thing I want to point out about this turn. Now recall during the feed phase, Rudolf had 2 provender, and he was able to first feed himself and then use the second one to feed Andreas. But let's say that whole phase had started with Rudolf holding just 1 provender. Who gets it? And the rules explicitly say that a lord must feed himself before he shares. So, most players would consider Andreas a much more valuable lord than Rudolf, and so they would want to say, well, since there's only 1, I'm going to feed Andreas and let Rudolf's service marker move. But that's not an option. Rudolf holds the provender. He feeds with it first. All right, this looks like a good place to wrap up the rules challenge. The last couple command cards are just Yaroslav taxing and the Karelians doing a couple forage actions, so I don't think we need to walk through those. I hope you got something useful out of the video. If you think I got something wrong or have a question, don't hesitate to leave a comment. Again, I'm Carter Maxwell. This has been Rules Challenge, and I'll see you soon.